Good morning. Barry Bryson here. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. We're continuing our study of Paul's co-workers in the book of Acts and in the letters today, and we have talked about Barnabas and about Priscilla and Aquila. We're going to spend one session talking about Silas. Silas was the first co-worker that Paul took with him after he and Barnabas had parted ways. We meet Silas in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15 at the Jerusalem conference when they all talked about the issue of the conversion of the Gentiles and whether they had to observe the law of Moses, and everybody said absolutely not. And they wrote a letter that represented, the word of the apostles, and it was going to be the circular letter, and they want to send it out. And it says in verse 22, "It seemed good to the apostles and elders with the whole church to choose men from among them to send to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas," with this decision, "Judas, called Barsabbas, and Silas, who were leading men among the brethren." So Judas, Barsabbas, and Silas were the two men chosen from among the folks at Jerusalem, the Christians at Jerusalem, to represent the folks at Jerusalem back in Antioch, to go back to Antioch with Barnabas and Paul. And we learned this about him in chapter 32, that the letter went back, they read it, everybody rejoiced in Antioch, and it says, "And Judas and Silas, also being prophets themselves, encouraged and strengthened the brethren with a lengthy message." And after they had spent some time there, they were sent away from the brethren in peace to those who had sent them out. So, we learned this about Silas. He was a prophet. He had special spiritual gifts. And he himself, along with Judas, encouraged the folks in Antioch before being released to go back. And then the next thing we find out is that when Paul and Barnabas part ways over John Mark, and we'll talk about John Mark next time, the first person he goes to get is Silas, and he goes and takes Silas with him. So Silas and he had become close. He had made an impression on Paul. So when Paul needed another partner, the first person he thought of was Silas, and Silas goes with him back to Lystra and Derbe. And Lystra and Derbe is where they meet Timothy, and Timothy is converted, and Timothy joins, and immediately it's Paul and his entourage, but the two closest to him are Timothy and Silas. And so we learn from the book of Acts, chapters 16 through 19, that what happened after Paul went to Macedonia, he received the Macedonian call, he took Timothy and Silas with him. And we all know that Paul was bounced out of Macedonia quite quickly after only visiting 3 towns. He is in Philippi for a few weeks, and he goes to jail there, and they jail him and Silas. I don't know why they didn't jail Timothy, but they jail him and Silas in Philippi. And Silas and Paul are the two in the inner prison, in the stocks, in the torture device, at midnight when they're singing and praising God, and God sends the earthquake, and they baptize the Philippian jailer. So Silas is there for all of it. For some reason, Timothy avoided that incarceration, but Paul and Silas are there. And then when Paul has to leave Macedon and goes to Ephesus, he leaves Timothy and Silas behind, which we're told about in chapter 17, and Paul was waiting for them at Athens. In chapter 17, immediately the brethren sent Paul out to go as far as the sea. Silas and Timothy remained there, and then Paul goes on to Athens, and they come back with a report. They return and join the Apostle Paul, and we read about that in chapter 18, and then they're sent back to Macedonia. And so Timothy and Silas are sent back to Macedonia and they go there multiple times. He goes to Berea, and Timothy goes to Thessalonica, which we're told about in the book of Thessalonians and First Thessalonians. Paul writes to the Thessalonian brethren for First and Second Thessalonians from himself, Timothy, and Silas. And then in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 19, we're told about Silas's work among the brethren at Corinth, and that he preached there, as did Timothy. And Paul said, our preaching was not yes, yes, no, no. You knew exactly what we had to say. That's what we know about Silas. His name shows up as Silvanus sometimes. That's probably the longer form of his name, and Silas is the shortened form, like John instead of Jonathan. But we don't know his end, what happened to him at the end of his life. But we know that he was a man that was highly thought of by the brethren